They had already cleared a space for your absence. That line alone explains the discomfort you're feeling right now. Somewhere, decisions were made with the quiet assumption that you wouldn't still be here. Timelines were adjusted. Relief was scheduled. Emotional luggage was unpacked early. You weren't meant to cross this part of the calendar standing upright, breathing, aware, and still becoming. Yet here you are, stubbornly present, ruining expectations without even trying. Here's a fact people don't like to admit. Human beings don't just predict outcomes. They prepare emotionally for other people's failure. It makes life easier. When someone is expected to fall off, everyone else relaxes. No accountability, no reevaluation, no awkward apologies later. Your disappearance was supposed to make things tidy. Survival, unfortunately, is messy. What makes this situation tense isn't that you're still alive or still moving forward. It's that your presence exposes how early some people gave up on you. They had already rehearsed conversations where your name came up in the past tense. They had mentally archived you under almost, could have been, or worse, we knew it. Now they're stuck updating a narrative they thought was finished, and updates make people nervous. There's also a quiet irony here that deserves a smirk. You didn't survive with dramatic flair. No announcement, no parade. You just didn't disappear. And somehow, that's more unsettling than a loud comeback. You forced people to keep their opinions current, and nobody likes renewing a judgment they hoped would expire. This isn't about proving anything or claiming a crown. It's about the subtle panic that sets in when someone refuses to exit on schedule. You weren't supposed to be around after everything that happened, after everything that was said, after the silent countdown others were running in their heads. But calendars changed, seasons passed, and you remained. Not louder, not desperate, just inconveniently intact. So if things feel strange, tense, or oddly quiet around you, understand this. It's not confusion. It's recalculation. You didn't just survive past Christmas. You stayed long enough to make unfinished assumptions very uncomfortable. Number one, your continued existence disrupted a timeline people had already emotionally buried. People don't just give up on others by accident. They do it quietly, internally, and far earlier than they'll ever admit. Long before anything is said out loud, a mental deadline is set. A private conclusion is reached. In their minds, you were already filed under won't make it, and life moved forward from there. Your struggles became a closed chapter they no longer planned to reread. What's unsettling is not that you survived hardship. It's that you survived past the point they stopped accounting for you. They had already reorganized their expectations. Emotional energy was withdrawn. Sympathy expired. Some even felt relief because writing you off simplified things. They no longer had to watch, support, reconsider their role, or feel uncomfortable about how little they did. Your absence was convenient. When you didn't disappear, it forced a quiet collision between reality and their internal schedule. Suddenly, their assumptions were wrong, and wrong assumptions feel personal to people who pride themselves on being realistic. Your continued presence exposed how casually they predicted your ending. That's not easy to sit with, so the discomfort turns into tension, distance, or strange behavior that makes no sense on the surface. There's also guilt hiding underneath all this. Not loud guilt, subtle guilt. The kind that whispers, "I thought they were done," and follows it with, "What does that say about me?" Instead of dealing with that question, many people choose irritation. It's easier to feel annoyed by your persistence than to confront how early they emotionally buried you. What makes this even heavier is that you didn't come back as a ghost of who you were. You came back aware. You came back remembering. You came back carrying the quiet knowledge that some people stopped believing before the story was finished. That awareness alone changes how you move, how you speak, and how much access you give. Your existence didn't just extend beyond a rough season. It invalidated a conclusion others had already accepted as final. And people rarely forgive those who force them to reopen a file they were confident was closed. Number 2, they converted your absence into emotional leverage, and you refuse to vanish on schedule. When people assume someone is on their way out, they don't just wait. They use that expectation. Your presumed absence became a tool in their hands, something they leaned on to justify choices they didn't want to explain. They spoke freely, acted loosely, and crossed lines because they believed there would be no consequences. After all, you weren't supposed to be around long enough to notice. Your struggle gave them permission. Permission to dismiss you, talk over you, replace you, or take what they wanted without resistance. They told themselves it was temporary, that you wouldn't remember, or that it wouldn't matter soon. Emotional leverage works best when the other person is expected to disappear quietly. That was the plan. What they didn't expect was your refusal to exit on cue. You stayed, not frozen in the state they left you in, but evolving. And that's where things shifted. The words they threw around casually now had a witness. The decisions they made, assuming no accountability, suddenly had a face attached to them again. Leverage only works when the other person doesn't come back to collect. There's a specific kind of discomfort that comes from realizing your actions were built on a false assumption. People hate that feeling. It exposes how conditional their kindness was and how quickly they exploited vulnerability. So instead of owning it, they react with tension, avoidance, or forced friendliness that feels slightly off. They're adjusting in real time to a reality they didn't plan for. What stings most is that you didn't return begging for fairness. You returned standing. You didn't argue your worth. You didn't demand explanations. By simply remaining present, you removed the advantage they thought they had. Their leverage expired the moment you proved you weren't going anywhere. And here's the part they won't say out loud. Your presence reminds them that they made choices, assuming your silence. Now that silence didn't arrive, you stayed long enough to remember who used the situation and who didn't. That memory alone is power, not loud power, not vengeful power, just the kind that makes people uneasy because it can't be undone. Number 3, you were supposed to be a lesson, not a survivor. Some people plan for others to fail long before anything actually happens. They don't just anticipate setbacks, they assign meaning to them. Your struggles were meant to serve a purpose for someone else's narrative. You weren't supposed to come out of it intact. You were supposed to be a cautionary tale, a living reminder of what happens when boundaries are crossed, trust is broken, or ambition is underestimated. Your supposed downfall was already built into the story they wanted to tell long before you even realized it. When you survived, it threw everything off. Suddenly, the lesson didn't land. The story was no longer tidy. The people who had invested emotionally, strategically, or even selfishly in your supposed failure had to face a glaring truth. Their control, their predictions, their plans, they were wrong. Survival wasn't just inconvenient, it was unacceptable. What makes this particularly sharp is the subtle humiliation it creates. When someone expects to see a person broken and instead sees them standing taller, it forces a mirror into the room. It reflects insecurity, laziness, and false assumptions. People who thought they could teach you a lesson without confrontation now have to reckon with the fact that lessons don't always work the way they want. You didn't perform on cue. You didn't bend to expectation. You refused to be a tool for someone else's story. Your survival speaks louder than any words could. It highlights the gap between planning and reality, between desire and outcome. It exposes the arrogance of anyone who believes they can dictate the arc of another person's life. And because you returned with awareness intact, your continued existence isn't just a contradiction of their expectations. It's a constant, living argument against the idea that anyone can be written off prematurely. The most discomforting part for them isn't your strength. It's the reminder that power, influence, or cleverness cannot manufacture obedience. Lessons are optional, and survival doesn't require approval. You weren't supposed to be around to remind them of that truth, but your presence does every single day, quietly, relentlessly. Number 4, your survival exposed how premature their celebrations were. Some people are quick to rejoice in what hasn't even happened yet. They counted their victories, planned their congratulations, and settled into relief before the story had even finished. Your supposed disappearance was a reason for their quiet celebration, an invisible confetti moment no one announced, but everyone felt. They imagined the weight lifted, the space cleared, and their own lives suddenly easier. That kind of premature celebration feels powerful in the moment, but it's fragile, and you shattered it simply by being alive. When you returned or simply continued, the illusion crumbled. That comfort they felt, the quiet relief, the unspoken sense of security, they were all based on the assumption that your role in their world was finished. Survival doesn't just extend your life, it ruins the emotional spreadsheets other people have been quietly filling. Every plan they made, every sigh of relief they allowed themselves, suddenly demanded a recalculation. There's a sting in that for them that can't be ignored. It's not just that you survived, it's that your survival made their effort look lazy. They had rehearsed endings, assumptions, and consequences. They thought you'd disappear in a predictable arc. They didn't account for awareness, resilience, or the simple fact that people are not obligations to be ticked off like boxes on a list. Their early celebration now looks foolish, and fools are easy targets for irritation, resentment, and even fear. Your presence forces them to confront a truth they tried to skip. Nothing should be celebrated until it's real. Premature triumph only exposes the gaps in judgment, the laziness of thought, and the arrogance of assuming control over outcomes. Your continued existence acts like a mirror held up to everyone who had already claimed victory over you. That mirror doesn't lie, and it doesn't forgive. The uncomfortable part is that you didn't need to announce your return or dramatize your survival. You simply persisted, quietly and undeniably, in a way that makes their quiet celebrations look absurd. In doing so, you didn't just survive. You made them rethink the very timing of their victories. And that reflection is far more unsettling than any loud confrontation could ever be. Number 5. They rehearsed a version of history where you didn't make it past the year. Long before anyone said it out loud, some people had already written the ending for you in their heads. They crafted a version of history where your struggles concluded neatly, where your disappearance fit perfectly into the timeline they needed. They didn't just expect you to fail. They rehearsed it over and over in private mental scenes that made them feel secure, clever, or justified. In their minds, the story was complete, the lesson delivered, and the emotional work done. You were a character in someone else's narrative, and they were the ones holding the pen. When you didn't disappear, it shattered the script they had memorized. Their rehearsed version of events relied on your absence, and suddenly reality refused to follow the lines they had written. Every expectation they had built, every sigh of relief they allowed themselves, every narrative they told quietly to others about your supposed ending was thrown into chaos. You weren't supposed to exist in their timeline anymore, and your presence became an undeniable contradiction. The tension this creates is subtle but relentless. People don't like when the story they've rehearsed collapses because it exposes assumptions, biases, and weaknesses they'd rather ignore. They have to process the dissonance quietly, to adjust their mental scripts, and sometimes to hide the embarrassment of being proven wrong. Survival isn't just stubbornness, it's a disruption. You force others to reckon with the fact that they counted your story finished when it wasn't, and that makes them uncomfortable in ways they can't always articulate. What makes this even more powerful is that you didn't return to play out someone else's drama. You didn't try to prove them wrong with flair or confrontation. You simply persisted, quietly existing as a living proof that their predictions were premature. That silent defiance rewrites their history without a single word spoken. Your continued presence dismantles the rehearsed narrative of those who expected your absence, forcing them to face a reality they never prepared for. They now live alongside a truth they cannot erase. Their version of your story was never yours to finalize. Number 6. Your presence forces them to relive decisions they hoped time would erase. Time is supposed to heal, to soften, to blur the sharp edges of mistakes and regrets. That's the story people tell themselves to sleep at night after doing things they're not proud of. They make choices, act carelessly, or speak without thought, and then rely on time to carry the guilt away quietly, like an invisible eraser. Your absence was meant to guarantee that erasure. They expected the calendar to do what courage wouldn't. They thought that by the time you were gone, the memory of what they did, what they said, and how they acted would fade into irrelevance. Your return, or even just your continued presence, destroys that illusion. Suddenly, the decisions they hoped would dissolve are right there in front of them, vivid and unavoidable. You don't let the past hide behind distance or silence. Every word they whispered, every choice they rationalized, now has context, consequence, and a living witness. The tension this creates is subtle but powerful. They are forced to confront themselves in a way they weren't ready for, to acknowledge that their actions were recorded not just in memory, but in someone who endured and remembered. This isn't about revenge or spectacle. You don't need to announce what you've seen or call attention to what you know. Your mere presence does the work. It is a quiet, relentless reminder that the past isn't negotiable simply because time has passed. They hoped absence would protect them, but it didn't. Time can't erase what someone still stands to witness. What makes it even more unsettling is that they can't undo it. Your presence doesn't allow excuses to stick or convenient narratives to survive. They wanted a clean slate, and you refused to provide one. You became the unspoken truth they can't escape, the living record of decisions they thought were buried. By existing past their expectation, you forced them to relive discomfort, confrontation, and accountability without saying a single word. That quiet reckoning, that refusal to vanish, is far more destabilizing than any argument or accusation could ever be. Number 7, they mistook your endurance for compliance. Some people confuse silence with agreement. They see someone quietly surviving, someone navigating hardship without loud protest, and immediately assume submission. They think endurance equals obedience, that patience or resilience means permission to act without consequence. That assumption is rarely intentional, it's convenient. It allows them to operate with less effort, less conscience, and less accountability. When someone appears to take it, the world assumes they've accepted the terms, even if they haven't. Your endurance shattered that misconception. They expected a version of you who would bend to expectation, who would vanish quietly, or at least allow your treatment to go unnoticed. When you remained steadfast, present, and unbroken, it became clear that endurance is not agreement. You didn't sign off on their assumptions or validate their behavior. You simply kept moving forward, alive and aware, and that presence exposed how badly they misread strength. What makes this dangerous for them is that it undermines control. People plan based on assumptions. When assumptions are wrong, strategy fails. They believed your quiet resilience meant compliance, and suddenly all their calculations, all the concessions they took for granted, had no foundation. The comfort of acting without resistance evaporated the moment it became obvious that your survival was deliberate, conscious, and uncooperative, not in words, but by simply existing and refusing to vanish. Endurance has a subtle power. It doesn't scream. It doesn't demand. It simply refuses to validate the narrative others want to impose. And for people who thrive on control or expect outcomes to bend to their will, that quiet defiance is more destabilizing than any confrontation. It forces them to reckon with their own overconfidence, their misjudgment, and the reality that influence is not the same as command. Your endurance didn't just preserve you, it revealed them. It highlighted how quickly they assumed authority over someone else's life and how easily they mistook patience for compliance. By surviving without submission, you shattered the illusion that you could be dictated to, proving that true strength often goes unnoticed until it quietly refuses to conform. Number 8, you outlasted their attention span, and that's unforgivable to insecure people. Some people operate on short timelines when it comes to others. They expect struggles to be brief, resilience to be temporary, and presence to be convenient. When someone goes through hardship, the world watches for a moment, checks the boxes of sympathy or judgment, and then moves on. The assumption is simple. If endurance takes too long, interest will fade. They believe attention is a currency they control, and if someone overstays their expected drama, it becomes inconvenient. You broke that expectation. You didn't disappear quickly. You didn't fit into the neat, manageable period they had allotted for your story. Your continued presence, your ongoing survival, refused to align with the timeline they had unconsciously set. Suddenly, their comfortable narrative, the one where you faltered, broke, or quietly receded, was impossible. You forced them to face reality without the convenience of forgetting. For insecure people, this is intolerable. Insecurity thrives on predictability. They rely on short attention spans to feel safe, to avoid confronting failure, guilt, or their own shortcomings. When someone refuses to adhere to that expected timeline, it exposes the fragility of their assumptions. The fact that you endured beyond their mental deadline highlights how little control they truly have, and that truth unsettles them deeply. Your persistence doesn't need fanfare to be disruptive. It doesn't need announcements or confrontations. Simply outlasting their expectation is enough to create tension, resentment, or even quiet panic. They were counting on time to dilute your presence, and you refused to cooperate. Your endurance forces them to acknowledge their miscalculations, to confront their impatience, and to sit with the discomfort of realizing someone else's life isn't theirs to schedule. By outlasting attention, you exposed insecurity as it really is, a desperate need for control disguised as casual observation. And in doing so, you became more than just a survivor. You became a reminder that some people assume timelines over lives, and when those assumptions fail, the world looks very different and far more uncomfortable than they ever expected. Number 9. Your resilience made their effort look lazy. Some people like to measure themselves against others, but they do it on the assumption that effort is visible and results are predictable. They plan, they scheme, they push in ways they think will break someone or force them into a corner. They assume that resistance is fragile and endurance is temporary. They believe that if they apply enough pressure, or even just enough observation, they can control the outcome. The problem is, they underestimated you. Your resilience exposed the laziness hidden behind their assumptions. Every shortcut they took, every half measure, every attempt to manipulate or predict you now looked small compared to the quiet, relentless strength you carried. You didn't need to announce your persistence. You didn't stage dramatic comebacks or force recognition. You simply kept moving forward, intact and aware, while their so-called effort revealed itself for what it truly was: minimal, opportunistic, and often ineffective. This makes people uncomfortable in ways they can't quite admit. When they thought they were exerting influence, they were actually revealing how unprepared they were for true endurance. They believed the challenge was theirs to manage, but it turns out the real challenge was yours to survive. And surviving isn't just about showing up. It's about maintaining awareness, control over yourself, and the ability to persist quietly while others assume they're making a difference. Resilience has a subtle, devastating effect. It doesn't scream. It doesn't demand attention, but it quietly shames those who relied on appearances, assumptions, or half-hearted attempts at control. It exposes the gap between intention and impact. They acted as though their effort could bend you, shape you, or erase you, and you simply refused to comply. By existing beyond their calculations, you make their attempts look careless, their strategies shallow, and their confidence premature. Your survival doesn't just prove strength. It highlights the contrast between genuine endurance and the illusion of influence. In doing so, you silently rewrite the rules. Resilience isn't about proving a point. It's about showing that true effort isn't what they thought it was, and their work is never enough when faced with someone who refuses to break. Number 10. They were counting on exhaustion to finish what hostility started. Some people rely on the slow grind of fatigue to get what they want. They know they can't always force compliance directly, so they wait, hoping time and pressure will do the work for them. Harsh words, small betrayals, relentless demands. These aren't always about immediate impact. They're about wearing someone down, letting the constant weight of hostility erode confidence, energy, and willpower. They counted on you reaching that breaking point, quietly surrendering to the rhythm they set. But you didn't. You refused to let exhaustion be the instrument of your defeat. Every attempt to drain you, every expectation that you would falter under pressure, failed because endurance isn't just about stamina. It's about awareness, strategy, and maintaining presence even when the world pushes against you. You didn't collapse quietly. You didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing their hostility succeed. By standing firm, you transformed their carefully timed plan into something meaningless. The effect of this is more than just inconvenient for them. It's deeply unsettling. People who rely on subtle forms of control assume a predictable outcome. Fatigue will soften resistance, time will dull awareness, and tension will eventually bend the person under pressure. When that doesn't happen, the system they built for their own comfort collapses. They didn't expect someone to endure with clarity. They didn't plan for resilience that refused to tire. Their method becomes a glaring reminder of their miscalculation. What makes it even more potent is that your endurance isn't performative. You didn't flaunt your strength or boast about your awareness. You simply survived under pressure, fully conscious, fully present, and fully unbroken. That quiet persistence does more damage than confrontation. It forces them to reckon with the limits of their control, the futility of their tactics, and the fact that they misjudged you entirely. By refusing to let exhaustion dictate your outcome, you didn't just survive. You rewrote the rules of engagement. You showed that hostility alone cannot conquer someone who refuses to surrender, and that the most dangerous power isn't aggression, it's unyielding endurance paired with awareness. Number 11. Your continued growth exposed how little growth they've had. Growth isn't always visible, and some people spend their lives pretending it is. They measure themselves in appearances, in talk, in promises made but never kept. They pat themselves on the back for progress that is shallow, incremental, or even imagined, while quietly expecting others to stay stagnant, predictable, and manageable. They assumed you would bend, plateau, or vanish under pressure. And in that expectation, they confirmed their own sense of superiority. Then you grew, not loud, not performative, not in ways meant to make anyone jealous, but in ways that mattered. You developed resilience, awareness, and strength quietly, steadily, without asking permission or waiting for validation. Your growth wasn't a show, it was a consequence of persistence, reflection, and refusing to be defined by anyone else's expectations. And that exposed the uncomfortable truth. While you were evolving under pressure, many of the people who judged, dismissed, or underestimated you were stuck in the same patterns, relying on old assumptions and calling that stability success. This gap between your development and theirs is corrosive. It forces them to see themselves in stark contrast to someone they tried to control or diminish. Your progress isn't just a personal victory, it's a mirror reflecting how little they have changed. The irony is brutal. They invested effort in limiting you, yet you were the one moving forward, quietly advancing beyond the timeline they imagined. Their stagnation, excuses, and assumptions suddenly look lazy, defensive, and insufficient. The discomfort this creates can't be overstated. They can't rewrite your journey, and they can't ignore it. Your growth undermines the authority they assumed they had over your narrative. It's not about proving them wrong. It's about existing as a living contradiction to their limited expectations. By continuing to grow while they remained predictable, you demonstrated that progress isn't about control, manipulation, or narratives. It's about persistence, awareness, and refusing to settle. And that truth is a quiet but relentless challenge to anyone who ever thought they had the power to define your limits. Number 12. They expected silence, not reflection. Some people assume that if someone survives, endures, or simply exists quietly, it means they have nothing to say. They believe silence equals acceptance, that absence of confrontation signals agreement, and that survival without spectacle is harmless. That assumption is dangerously convenient for them. It allows them to act without scrutiny, to make choices they wouldn't defend in daylight, and to assume control over a story that isn't theirs to write. What they didn't anticipate is that you don't just remain, you reflect. Reflection is subtle but powerful. It doesn't require speeches, dramatic gestures, or public declarations. It's a quiet awareness of what happened, who acted, and why. It's understanding the motives, the miscalculations, and the gaps between intention and action. Reflection doesn't ask for permission, and it doesn't require an audience to matter. It simply exists, quietly reshaping your understanding and sharpening your presence. Their discomfort comes from the invisible pressure reflection creates. You don't need to confront them for them to feel it. Every decision they made expecting silence now sits under scrutiny, even if unspoken. Every action taken in assumption of your compliance becomes visible in retrospect, not in accusation, but in quiet judgment. Their narrative, built on the idea that you wouldn't notice, wouldn't care, wouldn't remember, is suddenly flawed. Reflection turns absence into awareness, silence into witness, and endurance into understanding. What's particularly unsettling for them is that reflection is ongoing. It doesn't expire with time or distance. It grows sharper, more precise, and more illuminating the longer you exist beyond their expectations. They thought the story was theirs to control, that silence would protect them. Instead, reflection exposes gaps in morality, misjudgments in strategy, and the arrogance of assuming obedience. By simply reflecting, you refuse to be defined by their assumptions. You turn quiet survival into power. They didn't expect awareness paired with endurance, and it unsettles them more than confrontation ever could. Reflection doesn't yell. It recalibrates the room, rewrites assumptions, and proves that surviving silently doesn't mean you've surrendered your understanding or your truth. Number 13, you didn't just survive, you recalibrated your standards. Survival alone tells a story, but it's often misunderstood. Many assume that making it through means simply enduring the storm, taking whatever comes and adjusting minimally to get by. That's what people expect. They assume survival is passive, that it's about compromise, tolerance, and quiet submission. What they don't anticipate is someone who survives with intention, who refuses to let past treatment define future boundaries, and who actively recalibrates the standards by which they live and engage. You didn't just exist past adversity. You examined it, you measured it, you learned from it, and most importantly, you redefined what you would accept moving forward. The people who assumed your endurance meant compliance failed to grasp that survival is more than stamina. It's insight. Every experience you endured became a reference point, a compass guiding you toward higher expectations, stronger boundaries, and sharper awareness. You didn't just bounce back. You adjusted the rules for your own life, and in doing so, made it impossible for others to treat you the same way again. This recalibration is profoundly unsettling to those who relied on predictability. They expected the same version of you, the one who could be pushed, ignored, or underestimated. They didn't plan for someone who survived adversity and changed in the process. Your standards act as a quiet barrier against repetition. They force people to recognize that past patterns no longer apply, and that attempts to manipulate, exploit, or underestimate you will meet resistance. There's an invisible power in this. It's not loud or vengeful. It doesn't need confrontation to be effective. It simply exists in the way you operate, the choices you make, and the boundaries you enforce. Others sense it instinctively, even if they can't articulate it, and that makes them nervous, frustrated, or resentful. By surviving while recalibrating your standards, you didn't just endure adversity, you transformed it into authority over your own narrative. You became a force that can't be replayed, rewritten, or casually predicted. You turned resilience into a blueprint for power, and that is far more disorienting than any argument or confrontation could ever be. Number 14, your survival rewrote the power structure without asking permission. Power is often assumed, not earned. Many people operate under the illusion that influence comes from position, proximity, or control over circumstances. They believe that by manipulating, intimidating, or predicting outcomes, they can maintain authority over those around them. They craft hierarchies quietly, expecting compliance to solidify the structure. They assign roles, label weaknesses, and prepare for predictable results. Your absence was supposed to reinforce that system. It was supposed to maintain the balance they built in their minds. Then you survived. You didn't need to announce it. You didn't need to confront anyone directly. You simply continued, existing on your own terms, moving through life with awareness, boundaries, and clarity. That quiet persistence dismantled assumptions. The power structure they thought was secure, built on expectation, absence, and obedience, collapsed simply because you refused to vanish. Your survival demanded recalibration. It proved that authority based on assumption and manipulation is fragile when faced with someone unwilling to conform. This shift is more than symbolic. It forces them to adjust strategies, rethink judgments, and reconsider the narratives they relied upon. People who assumed control over your story now find themselves reacting to your presence rather than guiding it. Their confidence erodes not because you fought them loudly, but because your endurance and clarity expose the limits of their influence. What they thought they managed, scheduled, or predicted no longer applies. You didn't ask permission, and in doing so you reclaimed territory they assumed was theirs. The unsettling truth for them is simple. Power that isn't rooted in respect or earned through genuine influence is temporary. It survives only as long as assumptions hold. By existing, adapting, and thriving, you rewrote the unspoken rules. You demonstrated that control is not a gift to be granted, nor a hierarchy to be maintained. It's a dynamic that can shift quietly, decisively, and without warning. Your survival didn't just challenge expectations, it reset the balance. You turned assumptions into vulnerability and showed that true authority isn't given. It's taken through presence, awareness, and refusal to conform. Conclusion: your story isn't just about survival, it's about disruption, awareness, and quiet power. Every expectation others had, every plan they made for your absence, every assumption about your limits has been challenged by your presence. You didn't just endure adversity, you exposed miscalculations, revealed laziness, dismantled false narratives, and rewrote the rules without a single word. You forced people to confront their assumptions, reflect on their choices, and reckon with the fragility of control they thought they held. Survival alone might be impressive, but what makes your journey extraordinary is how you turned it into influence. You didn't just exist, you evolved. You recalibrated your standards, held awareness as your weapon, and quietly redefined the balance of power. Your resilience became a mirror, your endurance a statement, and your continued presence a reckoning. People who thought they could count on your silence, your compliance, or your disappearance now live with the truth. You are neither predictable nor controllable. You are proof that true strength lies not in drama or confrontation, but in persistence, clarity, and the refusal to conform to someone else's timeline. This is more than a story of surviving hardship. It's a lesson in quiet authority, unshakable awareness, and the power of presence. It reminds everyone watching that life cannot be dictated by assumptions, and that the most profound influence often comes from simply refusing to vanish. Every subtle decision, every boundary set, every moment of continued growth reshapes the narrative and recalibrates expectations, not just for yourself, but for everyone who underestimated you. If this message resonated with you, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story that challenges the ordinary. Give this video a like, drop your thoughts in the comments, and share it with someone who needs to see what true resilience looks like. Stay aware, stay unshakable, and remember, presence is power. Stay blessed always, and Happy New Year.